The humid Georgia air felt heavy, even with the air conditioning on full blast. It had been 10 years since I married Mark, 10 years since we said I do, under a scorching July sun, much like today. Now the only heat I felt was the uncomfortable simmer of a forbidden attraction. Mark's nephew, Alex, had arrived a few weeks ago, fresh out of college, and seemingly with the world at his feet. Or so it seemed. He was supposed to be a temporary guest, just until he found his place and a job in Atlanta. I hadn't given it much thought. He'd always been a quiet, almost invisible presence at family gatherings, polite but distant. But something about him was different now. He was taller, broader, and those boyish features had matured into something striking. At first, he kept to himself, mostly locked away in the guest room, sending out resumes and making calls. Our paths rarely crossed. A quick hello in the kitchen, a nod in the hallway. I was too wrapped up in my own life to pay him much attention. Between my work as a graphic designer, keeping the house in order, and trying to keep the spark alive in my marriage, my days were full. Then came that stifling Sunday afternoon. Mark was out playing golf with friends, and outside, a storm raged, mirroring the turmoil brewing inside me. I went to the living room to grab a book, and there he was, sprawled on the couch, lost in a novel. He looked up when I walked in, and for a fleeting moment, his gaze lingered. There was a flash of something unexpected, something dangerous, that passed between us. His stormy blue eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that left me breathless. I dismissed it as my imagination, but the feeling lingered. He started appearing more often after that, always with a plausible reason, needing advice on a job application, offering to help with dinner. His compliments became more frequent, more personal. "That dress looks amazing on you, Aunt Sarah. You have the most beautiful laugh." Mark, oblivious to it all, had started working late more often. His advertising agency was launching a new account, and he was consumed by it. The evening stretched before me, long and empty, filled only with the quiet presence of my husband's nephew. Each night, the line between us blurred. We were careful, never touching, never saying anything outright, but the silence screamed with unspoken desire. One night, I was preparing dinner. The scent of garlic and herbs filled the kitchen. I was making Mark's favorite dish, chicken piccata, but my thoughts were far from him. Alex came in, offering to help. He stood close, too close, and I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Our fingers brushed as I handed him a cutting board, and a jolt shot through me. This wasn't innocent flirting. This was a wildfire waiting to ignite. "Thank you," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "You've been a big help around here," I added. He gave me a casual, innocent smile. "It's nothing," he replied, his voice low and husky. "I like being around you, Aunt Sarah." The air grew heavier, and I struggled to breathe. We were teetering on the edge of a cliff, and I knew with terrifying certainty that one wrong step would send us plummeting into the abyss. I hesitated, feeling as though I was crossing a line, even though technically this was just a moment, a fleeting exchange, but I didn't want to seem paranoid or uncomfortable, so I let it pass. Later that evening, we sat on the couch to watch a movie. The television cast an eerie glow over the room. At first, it was easy to focus on the film, a silly romantic comedy that Mark would have hated. But as the minutes ticked by, I became acutely aware of Alex's presence beside me. The way his arm brushed against mine when he reached for the remote, the soft sound of his breathing, the faint scent of his cologne, it all sent shivers down my spine. Halfway through the movie, he leaned closer. My heart raced. I told myself I should get up, make up an excuse, leave the room, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed frozen in place as the space between us disappeared. There was nothing overtly inappropriate in his actions, but the intensity of the moment was unmistakable. "I really appreciate you being here, Aunt Sarah," Alex said suddenly, his voice low and husky. "I've been feeling pretty lost lately, with graduation and trying to figure out my life. But being around you, it makes me feel like everything's going to be okay." I wasn't sure how to respond. There was a raw sincerity in his words, a vulnerability that caught me off guard. I felt an overwhelming urge to comfort him, to tell him everything would be fine. But I also knew we were teetering on the edge of something dark and intense. "It's more than that," he continued softly. "I don't know how to explain it, but I've never felt this way about anyone before." My breath caught in my throat. This was the moment I had both dreaded and anticipated. I knew I had to shut it down, to create distance before things went too far. But instead, I found myself frozen, unable to speak, unable to move. Alex leaned in, his face inches from mine. My heart pounded in my chest as the air between us seemed to crackle with tension. He wasn't touching me, but the closeness felt more intimate than any physical contact could have been. His eyes searched mine, pleading for something. Permission, comfort, reassurance. I couldn't tell. Suddenly, a loud clap of thunder shook the house, and the lights flickered. I jumped, startled, and the spell was broken. I need to check something in the kitchen," I stammered, my voice trembling even to my own ears. Alex blinked, momentarily surprised, but then nodded. "Of course, I'll pause the movie." I fled to the kitchen, my mind racing. What was I doing? How had I let things get this far? In the kitchen, I gripped the edge of the counter, trying to steady my breathing. I needed to regain control of the situation before it spiraled completely out of hand. But even as I stood there, trying to compose myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that the line we had been so carefully towing was about to be crossed, and I wasn't sure if I had the strength to stop it, or if I even wanted to. I lingered in the kitchen longer than necessary, pretending to busy myself with meaningless tasks, reorganizing utensils, wiping down a counter that was already spotless, anything to avoid going back to that room. My thoughts swirled in every direction, a storm of conflicting emotions, guilt, fear, excitement, and a longing I hadn't felt in years. How had I let this happen? More importantly, what was I going to do about it? The question echoed in my mind as I paced the kitchen, the cooling aroma of chicken piccata mocking my confusion. Finally, I knew I couldn't hide forever. I took a deep breath, steadied myself, and returned to the living room. Alex was still sitting on the couch where I'd left him, his posture tense. But when he looked up, he offered me a small, almost apologetic smile. "I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable, Aunt Sarah," he said softly. "That wasn't my intention." His words hung in the air between us, and I could tell he was waiting for some kind of reassurance, some sign that everything was okay. But the truth was, I wasn't sure if things could ever be okay after this. Still, I couldn't ignore the fact that we were both standing on the edge of a precipice. The question was, would either of us step back, or would we fall? "I just think we need to be careful," I said finally, choosing my words with caution. "We're both in a difficult place right now, and it's easy to misinterpret things." He looked down at his hands, his expression unreadable. "I know," he murmured. "I didn't mean to complicate things. It's just, I've always felt like I could talk to you, like you understand me in a way no one else does." His confession caught me off guard. I hadn't realized how deep his feelings ran, and the weight of his words stirred something inside me. But I couldn't allow myself to think about that. This was wrong. I knew it. We both knew it. I needed to stop this before it went any further. "Alex, you're Mark's nephew," I said, my voice now firmer. We can't do this. Whatever this is, it can't happen. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at me for what felt like an eternity, as if searching for something in my eyes. Then, slowly he nodded, accepting the truth we both already knew, but hadn't spoken aloud until now. You're right, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly followed by an unexpected pang of sadness. A part of me had wanted him to fight, to argue, to make me feel like this connection we had was something more than a fleeting mistake. But of course, that would have been a lie, and I knew it. We sat in silence for a while, the tension between us still thick, but now tinged with something else, a mutual understanding that this was the end. The question of what if would linger, but the line had been drawn. Some things are better left unspoken. The moment of decision hung heavy in the air, and in that quiet space, with the movie still paused on the screen and the rain still tapping against the windows, it became clear that the decision had already been made. I think I'm going to bed, I said finally, standing and avoiding his gaze. It's late, and we've both had a long day. Alex nodded again, saying nothing as I turned and walked away. As I climbed the stairs, I could feel his eyes on my back, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. Not if I wanted to maintain the fragile control I had just barely managed to reclaim. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every moment of the evening. What had just happened felt surreal, like a scene from a movie rather than something from my own life. Yet as real as it had been, I knew I had to let it go. For the sake of my marriage, for the sake of my sanity, I had to bury this before it turned into something much worse. But sleep didn't come easily. Despite everything, I couldn't shake the feeling that the story between Alex and me wasn't over. The days following that night felt strange, as if I were living in a parallel reality where nothing had changed on the surface, but everything felt different beneath it. Alex and I avoided each other as much as possible. When we did cross paths, it was with forced smiles and awkward silences. The air between us crackled with unspoken words, with the memory of that night in the living room. Thankfully, Mark remained oblivious, still consumed by work. His late nights at the office had become a constant, and while I had once resented his absence, it now felt like a blessing, giving me the space I needed to untangle my thoughts. But it also made it harder to avoid Alex. One afternoon, I was working in the garden, the sun beating down on my back as I pulled weeds from the flower beds, trying to distract myself from the turmoil within. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Alex standing there, a hesitant look on his face. "Can I talk to you, Aunt Sarah?" he asked. My heart sank. I knew this moment was coming, but I wasn't ready. Not yet. The days that followed that charged night in the living room had been a strange mix of relief and unsettling anticipation. Alex and I danced around each other, exchanging strained smiles and forced conversations. The unspoken hung heavy in the air, every accidental touch, every fleeting glance, a reminder of the forbidden territory we had nearly crossed. Mark thankfully remained unaware. He had returned from his trip and thrown himself back into work, his mind preoccupied. It was as if he was swimming in calm waters, blissfully unaware of the dangerous undercurrents swirling beneath the surface. Alex, for his part, seemed quieter than usual. He spent most of his time out of the house, at job interviews, or at a nearby coffee shop, working on his resume. A part of me felt relieved by the distance. It gave me time to breathe, to reflect on what had almost happened, to convince myself that it had been a momentary lapse in judgment. But another part of me, the part I didn't want to acknowledge, missed him. I missed the intensity of what we had shared, even if it had never crossed the line into something physical. A few days later, I found myself alone in the house again. Mark was working late, and Alex had gone out, or so I thought. I was sitting in the living room, lost in thought, when I heard the front door close softly. My heart skipped a beat. Alex was back. I didn't know what I was expecting or what I wanted. All I knew was that I wasn't ready for another confrontation. Not so soon. I was about to go upstairs when Alex appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk, Aunt Sarah," he said, his voice low but firm. I nodded, my stomach twisting into knots. I knew this conversation was inevitable, but I had hoped to avoid it for just a little longer. Alex stepped into the living room and sat on the edge of the sofa, as if he didn't quite belong there. I sat across from him, keeping a safe distance between us. The silence stretched out, thick with unspoken words. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," Alex said finally, breaking the silence. "And I think I need to leave." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't expected him to say that. "Leave?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Where would you go? Is this because of me?" He shook his head, his gaze fixed on the floor. "It's not just you," he said softly. "It's everything. I think staying here is making things harder for both of us. I need to figure things out on my own." I wanted to argue, to tell him he didn't need to go, that we could work through this. But deep down, I knew he was right. "I understand," I said finally, my voice trembling. "If that's what you think is best." Alex looked up at me then, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and something else I couldn't quite place. "I'm sorry, Aunt Sarah," he said, "for everything. I never meant to make things complicated." I swallowed hard, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. "I'm sorry too, Alex." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. "When are you leaving?" I asked eventually. "In a few days," he replied. I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything else. As Alex stood and walked out of the room, I felt a strange sense of relief and loss all at once. I knew this was the right decision for both of us, but it didn't make it any easier. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that this chapter of my life wasn't truly over. The story between Alex and me had reached its end, but the echoes of it would linger, a reminder of the lines we had almost crossed and the consequences we had narrowly avoided. Some things are better left in the past, no matter how tempting it is to look back. "I don't want you to feel like you have to leave," I said quickly, my voice trembling. "This is your family, Alex. You don't have to go because of what almost happened," he finished for me, his eyes locked onto mine. "We both know it's the right thing to do. I can't stay here pretending everything is fine when it's not. I've complicated things for you, and I need to take responsibility for that." His words were mature, thoughtful, and made my chest tighten with a mix of guilt and something else, something I didn't want to name. He was right, of course. His presence in the house had become a ticking time bomb, and we both knew that sooner or later, something would give. The only way to diffuse it was for one of us to leave. "You're not responsible for everything, Alex," I said softly. "We both played a part in this." Alex shook his head. "Maybe, but I'm the one who made things harder for you. Mark trusts me, and I betrayed that trust." Hearing Mark's name was like a cold splash of water, a harsh reminder of the man who had no idea what had been brewing under his own roof. The shame of it all hit me hard, and deep down, I knew Alex was doing the right thing. As much as I wanted to believe we could go back to how things were before, the truth was that we couldn't. Not now. "When are you leaving?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I have a friend in the city," Alex said. "I'll stay with him for a while until I figure things out. I'll tell Mark it's because I found a job opportunity there, something that makes sense." It was a clean exit, one that would spare Mark from ever knowing how close we had come to disaster. But as I sat there listening to Alex lay out his plan, I couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sadness. We had made the right decision, but it still felt like a loss. "I'll miss having you around, Alex," I admitted, surprising myself with the honesty in my voice. He gave me a small, sad smile. "I'll miss you too, Aunt Sarah. But this is for the best." We sat in silence for a moment longer, both knowing that this was the end of whatever had been building between us. There would be no dramatic goodbye, no last-minute confessions, just the quiet understanding that this was the right thing to do, even if it hurt. Alex stood, and I followed him to the door. When he reached the handle, he stopped and turned to look at me one last time. "I hope you'll be okay," he said softly. "I will," I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure if that was true. And with that, Alex opened the door and stepped out into the night, leaving behind the tension and the complicated mess we had almost fallen into. I watched him walk down the driveway, disappearing into the shadows, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could finally breathe. When Mark came home later that night, he kissed me on the cheek, completely unaware of the weight that had just been lifted from our lives. I smiled back at him, knowing that what had almost happened would remain a secret, a story that would never be told. And in the quiet of our home, I realized that we had all narrowly escaped something dangerous, something that could have changed everything. But as I lay in bed that night, listening to Mark's steady breathing beside me, I couldn't help but wonder, what if? What would have happened if we had given in to temptation? What would have happened if we had crossed that line? The questions lingered, unanswered, a reminder of the forbidden path we had almost taken. And as I drifted off to sleep, I knew that the memory of Alex and the almost romance that never happened would stay with me forever.